Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel, My Life in Scrubs. I'm Stacy. I'm a registered nurse. I've been in healthcare for 28 years and I'm just sharing stories about my nursing journey and about my nursing career. If I can help one person, that's really just the goal. This chair is something else. I think I would like to talk about a couple of times when I had a hard shift or I made a mistake, because I think that's the thing that you don't realize is that when you're a nurse, you're going to have hard days where you didn't do your best, and you might have days where you made a mistake. I think I'll talk about a medication error that I made. I pride myself on doing those 3 checks and knowing those 5-6 rights that we're supposed to know when I'm doing my med pass, and I pride myself on staying focused and still being able to multitask. But I will tell you that when you're drawing up a medication, you should never ever let something distract you, and if it is, you should put down what you're doing and start over again to make sure that you're doing the correct thing. There was an incident where I was working an evening shift and it was flu season and a lot of staff members out because they were at home with the flu. And so we were working with a very minimal amount of staff. And that meant that in addition to me being the nurse on the floor, I was also helping the CNAs on the floor in order to get through the shift. I think during that year, I probably even came in and worked on the floor as a CNA a lot that year. It seemed like we had some flu outbreaks. I was passing medication for the bedtime med pass, and a CNA needed my help with something, and I was in the middle of drawing up insulin. And I think I always wanted to be a nurse that would help my CNAs when I could. But I think that in this instance, I learned where I had to start drawing the line. I want to be helpful to my CNAs, and I want to, I don't ever want a CNA to feel like I wouldn't do something that I'm expecting from them. You know, sometimes as a nurse, we're going to put people on the toilet, we're going to do bed changes. I've helped CNAs do bed changes, pull people up many times, or transfer a person, because sometimes the CNA is alone on the floor and they do need your assistance, and especially in long-term care. I haven't always been able to help. Sometimes you do have to say no when you're a nurse, because sometimes what you're doing is critical, and if you make an error, it can be life-threatening and it can cause death. So in this particular instance, a CNA asked me for assistance, and I was drawing up insulin and I drew up the wrong insulin. And I even left the insulin vial on the medicine cart, because I have a habit of quadruple and checking the insulin 5 or 6 times. But I drew up fast-acting insulin instead of long-acting insulin. The vials were very similar, and they were in the wrong pockets, and I wasn't paying as close of attention as I should have, and I gave the wrong insulin dose, and I realized it immediately after I gave the insulin. And it wasn't like some crazy amount, but it was a lot of fast-acting insulin, and the second I realized I did it, I felt sick to my stomach, and I knew I didn't get in trouble. I'm not one of those nurses that's been in trouble throughout my career a bunch of times. I take my job very seriously, and I hate making mistakes. I'm not perfect, but I hate making mistakes. And I had to call the nurse practitioner and let her know that I had made a medication error. And I had to call the family, and I had to let the patient know that I made a medication error. And I spent several hours after that feeding the patient and checking their blood sugar, to the point that they did not want me in their room anymore by the time the end of my shift was there. And by the time, as my shift was winding down, that's when the blood sugar was beginning to drop. Luckily, there was no adverse event that happened as a result of this. I did have to write a medication error. It did go into my file, and I did have to take accountability for that medication error. And that is why it is so important in nursing to pay attention to what you're doing. And especially when you're administering medications to people and insulin and anything, you should just triple and quadruple check yourself to make sure that you're giving the right thing. You should know what you're giving. You should know how much of it that you're giving. You should make sure it's going to the right person in the right route, and that the right amount is being given. Like I said, luckily nothing adverse happened except for that the patient was furious with me. She got to eat a lot of candy bars and drink a lot of juice, and nothing like that ever happened again during my time in that job. But I will never, ever forget making that mistake and knowing why I made that mistake. I mean, I allowed myself to be distracted, and I didn't do what was expected of me in that moment. And then there are those times when you say the wrong thing. You say the wrong thing and you can't take it back. There's times whenever a person is at the end of their journey and they have symptoms that are not controlled, they're uncomfortable, and they're asking for help. I want to help people. I don't want to see people struggling at the end of their life. My goal is always to see comfort and to contact the doctor to get that comfort. In this particular case, it was an ICU situation where the patient had decided to do a GIP situation where they had decided that they wanted to come on to hospice. They were at the end of their journey, but their symptoms were very, very uncontrolled, and they needed some relief. Seeing a person in extreme distress is something that's an emergency to me. And in a hospital setting, they cannot always give the medication that can be given in hospice for comfort. They don't always have the ability to give the comfort medications that we can give in hospice. It was an older couple. They'd been married many years. And it was distressing for the family. It was distressing. There's always a lot of family around. There's always, which is great. I've seen cases where there isn't, but in this particular case, every member of the family was at the bedside, and the spouse was beside themselves. And the spouse was angry. The spouse was angry that they were losing their lifetime partner. And I think I learned a hard lesson that day, that sometimes you're not going to be able to say something to provide comfort, and sometimes you just need to be quiet and offer your presence in those cases, because there's no amount of words or cliches that are going to bring their partner back or remove that pain that they feel. No matter how old your spouse is, you don't want them to die and leave you. I think that the spouse knew that their partner was at the end of their journey and that they were uncomfortable, and they agreed to allow them to be comfortable. The person was going to die whether I intervened with medications or not. They were actively dying, just that they were actively dying in a very uncomfortable manner. And once the medications were given, the patient did pass comfortably, without screaming for help, without being restless, without being uncomfortable. There was no more thrashing around. There was no more crying out for help. There was no more restlessness. The patient was peaceful and breathing at a normal rate and passed peacefully. And the spouse said to me, "Well, that was horrible." And I said, "Well, at least there was no more suffering." And the second it came out of my mouth, I could not believe that came out of my mouth. The spouse said, well, that's one way to look at it. And I knew in that moment that I had failed to give that person any kind of comfort whatsoever. And I knew that there was nothing that I could say to come back from that moment. And in my heart and in my head, I certainly didn't mean that in a flippant way to invalidate that spouse's feelings. But I think sometimes you don't have the right words to say when a person is at the end of their life. Sometimes there is nothing that you can say to a partner to make it feel better or to make it lighter, because it's not light when you lose a partner of 50 plus years. It's not light when you lose the person that you've spent your life with. And clearly that person did not want to see their partner suffering, and that person surely had some relief in the idea that the suffering was relieved, but they also didn't want their partner to die. And watching your partner die after 50 plus years of marriage probably is one of the most horrible things that I could imagine. I think in this case, I wish that I had just offered silent support and reminded them that we were available if they needed any other help or if they had any questions. Because in this case, I created a negative feeling, more negative than the feeling that had already happened by watching their partner die. I also added a cliche statement that at least they weren't suffering. And in my head, I really just meant, maybe it should have stayed in my head, because in my head and in my heart, I thought, well, finally that patient was breathing comfortably, not gasping for air, not screaming out help, not thrashing around the bed. They were relaxed and peaceful and calm. And maybe that should have just been a feeling inside of me that I knew that I had given that patient comfort, rather than just accepting that I couldn't give that spouse any peace regarding the death of their partner. I should have just been quiet in that particular case. And that was a very hard day for me as a nurse, because sometimes you want to help and sometimes you can't. Sometimes it's beyond your ability to help. And those are things that we have to accept as a nurse too, is that sometimes things are beyond our ability to help. So there's those things that we can change, which are errors, and there's those things that we can't change, which are sometimes the way a person feels about a situation. We want to fix things when we're nurses. We want to do the correct things when we're nurses. And I think we encounter the opportunity to do those things every time we work. But sometimes we have to learn that we can't fix things, and sometimes we have to learn not to make a mistake that we can't fix as well. So those are two incidents that happened 2 different times in my career that stuck with me and made me think about my job as a nurse. Those moments made me question if I was doing the right job. And I have been a nurse for many years by both of those situations. And even now I have days where I think, did I make the right career decision? And again, I have to really think about it. But I love my job. I love what I do. I love being a nurse. I love the patients that I interact with, and I love the ability to make a difference no matter how small that is. Sometimes it's not about changing the world, but it truly is about changing one person's world and affecting one person's life. And I think that that is something that we don't give ourselves credit for. And I think that that is something, I think that we are not very graceful with ourselves, and sometimes we don't give ourselves the credit or the grace that others might give us. Sometimes we're harder on ourselves than we should be. And the important thing about making a mistake and having a hard day is learning from it, moving forward from it, and not doing it again. That's the important part. When you make a mistake, it's so critical that you evaluate what you could have done differently and don't do it again. And when you say the wrong thing to someone, which you inevitably will, because we're humans, it is so important to learn from that moment too. Everything we do as nurses is a learning moment and a teaching moment that we can pass on to others. You're always learning in healthcare, you're always learning as a nurse, and I think as nurses we're always sharing our experiences so that we can teach others to hopefully not make the same mistake that we make. And I would love to hear about a time that you had a hard day, or you made an error and what you did to correct it and how it affected your career. And I would love to answer any questions you might have. If you like my channel, then I would ask you to consider liking, subscribing, and following. And I hope to see you again soon.